We're all here. Well, this is fun. Thank you both for joining me. I've been, watching some of your work on Karen's channel, and I thought, I said a little while ago, I got to have some of the old timers back. So I thought, well, these two have been talking quite a bit together, so maybe I should have them on together. So thanks so much for joining. And if for those of you who have never watched, I did a couple of conversations with Michael, and I've had a couple of conversations with Karen. And Karen, of course, took off on her own channel and has had a lot of very interesting conversations on her channel. And in fact, Jordan tweeted a blog post in which one of your conversations was there. So I hope you get a little subscriber bump.
Well, I've had a big view bump, but no subscriber bump yet.
Okay. Well, it was funny because long time ago, when Jordan tweeted out the episode where I talked about The Office, I thought, oh, there's going to be a big bump. And not much of a bump. Twitter and YouTube are two separate things.
Yeah.
Well, what shall we? Oh, Michael, you had an idea. Why don't we start with that?
Yeah, I was thinking we could open the conversation with a little bit of prayer, just a real short one.
Okay.
So I'll begin here real quick. Dear Lord, I just wanted to thank you for just the lives and ministries of Paul and Karen and what you're doing in them through their YouTube projects. And I just want to ask that in our conversation today that you would be with us. And, we believe that you are the Spirit of truth, and that you would guide us into truth as we converse today, and that people out there who are listening will have a chance to hear and have this same Spirit of truth speak to them. In Jesus' name we ask this. Amen.
Amen. Amen. The video, it's always dangerous to talk about the next video that I'm going to do because things change, but I am working on a video on religiosity. I'm looking at Putnam's book, American Grace, that came out in 2010, where he tries to get after how religion divided and how religion polarized. And that was 2010. So that was before Trump. And so in some ways, even more so, but yet differently over the last 10 years. But so even opening a conversation with prayer will make a whole group of people just sit back and, I don't know if I like this. I don't know if you're making the room unsafe by closing our eyes and addressing the Almighty.
Yeah.
Michael and I had a fascinating conversation the other day about prayer. What is it? What does it do? And we thought it might be fun, right, Michael, to just maybe recap that a little bit.
Yeah. So specifically, I was thinking more about this from the perspective of the skeptic, and sort of like what Jordan Peterson would kind of describe as a sort of phenomenological experiment you can do with the act of prayer. And this came up pretty famously in his conversation with Sam Harris, where he's talking about, sitting at the edge of your bed, contemplating a situation where you've done something wrong. You're sincere in wanting to make things right. And you engage with a personification of your highest ideal and saying, what can I do? And you're willing. And his claim is that if you do this sincerely and you're willing to accept any response that will come, you'll get a response. Of course, in this particular setting, Sam Harris wouldn't engage with him at all in terms of this sort of phenomenological experiment. But I thought it would be interesting just to talk in a little bit more detail about, how might someone, engage with this on their own, again, from a skeptic's point of view. And one of the things I would like to suggest, perhaps for those who would experiment with this, is that if you engage in this sort of practice regularly, that is personifying and engaging in, let's even just call it an imaginative conversation with your highest ideal, it will, by your own definition, and I think that's important, this is a point Peterson makes quite frequently, by your own definition, improve your life. Because again, this is your highest ideal. And I think one of the reasons why people hear that and would perhaps be intrigued and maybe even go to the place where they actually think they're actually going to do this and then turn away is, as Peterson points out, as soon as you start interacting with that highest ideal, it simultaneously becomes a judge. And so there's this other dimension of being that opens up to you immediately, which is the ways in which you fall short of this ideal that is your self-defined, self-proposed ideal. That is, it is of your making. It's of your cognition and your awareness and familiarity. It is something you know very deeply because it's been with you your whole life. And so it's something you can't really deny in the same way as you might be able to deny, somebody else preaching a sermon or some moralist on their high horse telling you that you shouldn't, drink or do alcohol or drugs or whatever. Those kind of things that don't kind of resonate. This is you alone in your room. It's just you. And I think there is a sort of phenomenological experiment one can do with your own being and verify that there's a conversation that can be had. And it's with, by definition, some part of you that you define as of great, and high value. And that if you discipline yourself and engage with this, you will see changes in your perception of consciousness and being, which is really interesting. That I think anybody can do this. Whether you don't have to, subscribe to any of the supernatural stuff to observe this reality.
What do you think,
So
Karen?
I have a question, Michael. When you say your highest ideal, is that my highest self? Is that what you mean when you say your highest ideal? Or is it the same ideal that Jordan Peterson talks about when he says, fix your eyes on the highest good of which you can conceive, and then that will orient your goals, from that point? Is it that highest good, or is it my highest self?
Well, I think, no, it is a part of your being. It's something you certainly have a relationship to. Again, like I'm proposing that this is something you've been aware of your whole life, that you've, I guess Freud would call it the superego, right? It's something that's there all the time, passing judgment on you, and you interact with it all the times, and you make rationalizations to it, and you have these interactions with it. What I'm suggesting is, this is kind of in the line with what Paul has talked about in terms of the spirit of geometry versus the spirit of finesse, which is that when you take this extra step of personifying and having a conversation with something inside you, the circuitry in your head turns on as it relates specifically to attending to and paying attention to new information. It's kind of that right brain phenomenon where, as opposed to the spirit of geometry, where I can fairly safely assume that 1 + 1 = 2 forever and again. Like when I'm in that world, I don't have to pay attention, which is how many people engage with questions of right and wrong. What I'm proposing is something that's, in terms of a highest ideal, something way more amorphous that you couldn't. And I think when Peterson talks about the attempt to conceive of it as an ideal, there's some effort that he's referring to there, just to bring it into conscious articulation in your own mind so that you can hold it there to have that conversation with it, right? Like, because it's amorphous and defined, and in different contexts, it manifests itself in different ways to you phenomenologically. But again, the claim here is that it's real and that we all have it. And so I don't know, I'm just putting that forward because I think I'd be interested to hear other people's feedback in terms of especially from the skeptical end, like, okay, I did this and nothing happened. And, I would be interested to engage with people that thought that way about this, but I don't know. I don't know that you could, I'm trying to imagine how you could even engage with this and not get some sort of interaction back, because I do think there's something there that is common across all humans.
Well, in an age when people are playing around with paleo diet or organic natural foods because they have a sense that that modernity has lost its way, as I think this thing through, even from the bottom, from, let's say, a Jordan Peterson, it's sort of a natural theological perspective. The spirit of finesse, in fact, is the natural approach, the right brain approach to engaging with the thing that is too large to know, from the left brain.
Yeah.
And so if you say, well, I should exercise and eat this certain way because evolutionarily this is what we have, this is what our bodies were made for, the same holds true for that argument about the spirit of finesse, that the reason you talk to your car when it breaks down is because that's basically how you're wired. And you might know that, in a very real way, your car does not hear you, but your posturing towards the car is, in fact, and engaging in your car in that way is, in fact, how you were made. Now, for most people, this is where Sam Harris's arguments really break down, because he asserts, well, if you talk to your car, you're not going to take it to a mechanic. Well, you know what? Pretty much everyone I know both talks to their car and takes it to a mechanic. It's not an either or proposition. and
Totally.
And that's the same way for, people talk, well, Christians, yeah, you can find some people out there that will get it in their mind to do either or. And there is also a sense that there are moments when either or is a very important dynamic to come to terms with, to actually check where you're at. But this is, in fact, how we are made to respond to a world too large for us to comprehend. It's natural. No less natural than anything that's touted at Costco with organic and natural splashed all over the label.
I think in my specific background, the way I was raised, there was more of that either orness. And so and because of that, I did kind of, and that's from that more fundamentalist Pentecostal, like, to engage with the other side is a denunciation of the other. Like if I went to the doctor, I didn't really have faith that I was going to get healed, kind of thing. And so I did, and I think you're right that we have both sides of this for a reason, because they're both adaptive in different ways, and for different situations. And so it was always a problem for me growing up, in terms of, I felt like from my parents' perspective on prayer was like, okay, once I prayed about it, my responsibilities on this are over. Like I had my to-do list and I just transferred it over to God, and, I'm done here. And I was never comfortable with that. And I don't think that is the Orthodox Christian view on the subject of prayer. And so as I've re-engaged with my own faith, it's been one of those subjects that I've had a lot of trepidation around. Is like, well, what is it that I'm doing when I pray? And so I've always even had this sense of guilt when I pray, like, am I doing this just so I can feel like, okay, I don't have responsibilities towards the people I just prayed for? Cause like, I just prayed for them. So I'm like, okay, I'm good here. I've done the work. And so I've actually, asked God to like kind of show me a little bit more, like, what exactly is going on here. And in terms of easing back into having this as a part of my life, and what do I think I'm doing? And one of the things I do think you will find if you engage in this practice for some length of time is you will find lots of weird synchronicities, some of which from the skeptical point of view, you could explain as, well, it was a reorienting of my consciousness that I've disciplined myself to think about the world in this way. And now I'm noticing things I wouldn't notice of otherwise. But as me and Karen were talking yesterday, and I shared a few anecdotes, you will also likely experience anecdotes you can't explain in that way, other than that you've had some real communion with a larger consciousness as such that seems to have impacted things beyond what your own little consciousness could have had an impact on, at least in my experience. And not that proves anything, but I think it's an experiment people can run, I think, and see results.
I have a little example. I was telling Michael yesterday, so I didn't put it on tape, otherwise we could prove this, but it was after we had turned off the tape. I was telling him that yesterday morning I had spent some time praying and releasing my channel into God's hands, because there's a part of me that would like to get more viewership. And so I was wrestling with, what is that part of me that wants more viewership? Because I don't even care if people know my name. I don't have my name associated with it. I really think that my intention is that the people that I talk to who are so wonderful should have some visibility. So I was just praying and releasing the whole thing into his hands and saying, whoever you send my way to watch my videos, I'm perfectly happy with that. I'll take whatever viewer count I get, and that's up to you. But if there's something you want me to do to get more visibility, would you show me? And like 5 hours later, my Twitter feed is blowing up with, Karen, you're famous. Like, what happened? I didn't even know. Paul sends me this. Paul retweets this for me. Jordan Peterson just retweeted your video. So my previous video with Michael got about 100 views. The one I did with Annette is already up over 800 in a day. Now, that's not translating to comments. I'm not getting any more comments. I'm not getting any more subs. But, you know, God is doing something. I'm perfectly willing to leave that in his hands, and whatever he wants to do with it, that's fine. But it was such a current, you know, in the moment kind of a thing. So.
And I've had similar experiences many times, Karen, when one of the things that's conflictive for me in the modern era is that we have figured out how to put numbers on so many things. Once you put a number on something, all of these other things are built into it, such as my number and the other person's number. And I know, Michael, that you had said something about Jordan Peterson's personality class number 12. And that got back to me through Luke via the Discord. And so actually yesterday I re-listened to that class with tremendous appreciation. I probably hadn't listened to that class for two plus years, because I went through the bulk of his old material back in mid 2018 when I was, you know, just massively downloading and ingesting his stuff. But as he comments in that class, well, and as he lays out very well, and I think you're right that in some ways, if you want to, if you're philosophically bent and you sort of want a succinct argument for at least a good portion of Jordan's work, that class just sort of puts it right there for you. And a lot of the cognitive science elements that John Vervaeke also touches on, it's all right there. One of the things, Michael, you were talking about that I was thinking about when you were talking was towards the end of Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he makes an observation that, again, these are arguments from below, that even talking to, Jordan Peterson often talked about the fact that talking is thinking. And that's part of the reason I make the videos I make, because I started blogging because I learned that me sitting in my office thinking thoughts, then I'd start writing thoughts, and writing thoughts was more fruitful than just thinking them in my head. And then writing them and sharing them with other people, whether or not they responded, was more fruitful than just writing something in a journal, let's say, and then actually getting response and engagement back and forth from other people was more fruitful than just writing them and sending them to other people. And that, of course, led to the blogging and eventually to the videos and to the conversations and everything that I've been doing for the last 2+ years. Vervaeke makes a comment towards the end of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis that there are all these studies that basically show that, even if you're talking, even if you're processing with an imaginary partner, you are upping your level of cognition and openness and all sorts of things. And then if you take that and add that to a lot of what Jordan says in Personality 12 in 2017 about, the future and potential, again, even arguments from below, prayer, there's good reasons, even if, let's say, you're a dyed-in-the-wool secularist, iron box materialist, that this is in fact, these practices are what made humanity successful. And you probably avoid these practices and discourage these practices to others at your and their own peril, which is a fascinating thing.
Well, Paul, how Jordan Peterson is always talking about how a man should look for a woman with whom he can contend, right? A woman that is strong enough, intellectual enough. I don't know what all those characteristics would be, but a woman with whom he can contend, not somebody he can roll over. So you can think about that in terms of you're contending with an imaginary partner. Let's say I'm sitting around thinking about a discussion I might be having with my husband. Even in my mind, having that discussion with him, I'm contending with him because I kind of know the way he might answer. Of course, I'm probably gonna, be stereotypical in my thought process, but if I really want to contend with a partner that is going to be the greatest opportunity for learning for me, I want to contend with the best possible partner. So then you get into Jacob struggling with God on the road to wherever he was on the road to. I think it was at Bethany.
He was fleeing Laban, facing the fact that he's facing Esau. He was between Laban and Esau.
Yeah.
And that's where he has to contend with God.
Yeah, so he's contending with God. And in that sense, the prayer is, if you're really going to be authentic with prayer, you realize that you're contending with the highest possible ideal that you could be contending with. Having this conversation that is changing the way you see yourself and the way you think about the world and everything else.
Yes. No, I think that's very, there were many times listening to Jordan when the ontological argument came to mind. The ontological argument is such a tricky thing, as many philosophers, including Alvin Plantinga, have noted, that on one hand, it doesn't seem to work to convince people that there is a God, but it's really difficult to just dismiss because there's something to it. And there's something to it that keeps coming up in all of these arguments and all of these testings that we're running. And we don't know what that is. And again, this gets back to another piece that Jordan makes in that really excellent episode, which is that, anybody who's paying close attention to themselves will begin to realize that this, what I call the the conscious member of Congress, of the consciousness Congress, the conscious member, the one that's moving your lips, is is in some ways a minor representative that, as Peterson says, how do we know more in our dreams than our conscious selves know? What's going on with that? And then when we suddenly take these things, kind of amp them up with the ontological argument, they get very interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the things with Jordan Peterson especially is I feel like some of his most profound things that he says get glossed over because they seem so simple. And you know, this thing with the prayer I think is a great example of that, where it just sounds so trivial and so like something, the advice you'd give to a child, and so it's easily dismissed. Like even in that, you know, Sam didn't even feel any sort of obligation to take what he was saying seriously. Like it was just like so easily brushed aside. But there's a real depth that Peterson had engaged with that in that thing. And another thing that Peterson says that is similarly deep, but I think is looked at so trivially is this whole you know, tell the truth thing, which is unbelievably deep. And part of, I think, some of the depth of it is, this kind of pulls into something you've said before too, about like, you know, the relationship between the two things is its own thing. So like, you know, like in a marriage, the marriage itself becomes its own thing. And your relationship to truth becomes its own thing. And it's, you know, and you could think of truth as having this sort of activity where it's trying to show up in multiple ways, and you can have a relationship with it such that you have gotten very astute and good at hiding from it. And so this idea of this relationship with the truth and trying to take notice of when you're doing those little micro self-deceptions can lead you to some major discoveries about yourself and the nature of truth. Even though it's a very, he makes such a great point in terms of saying like, no, you don't ever really know if you are telling the truth, but you can at least steer away from these conscious twistings of the truth that get into the fabric of your being at this like very deep ontological level that you can't even see, but it's there. And when you get into a tough situation, how are you going to trust yourself if you've been lying all along?
Yeah. And his, you know, it took me, you know, a lot of the stuff that he said, you hear it, and, you know, this whole, I think about thinking fast and slow. My slow thinking is much better than my quick thinking. And so when I first heard him say things like, you know, tell the truth, at least don't lie, don't say things that make you weaker. And when you first hear that, it's like, oh, is this kind of a, you know, what is this kind of a toxic masculinity, macho thing? No, it's exactly what you just described. It's that lying makes you weaker. And, you know, even as you were talking now, I was thinking about the fact that, you know, even an ardent materialist like Sam Harris basically wants to say, you know, all there is matter. The longer I've thought about that, the more silly that gets, because what he's really asking is that people have a relationship to the truth. Okay, but then what exactly is that truth? It's not the matter, because even the word matter, if you go back again to the early Vervaeke classes where he talks about Aristotle, matter is essentially the translation of the Greek word wood. And the essence of wood that they assumed was its malleability. You could have a wooden bowl, you could have a wooden spoon, you could have a wooden chair, you could have a wooden table, you could have a wooden ship. Wood for them was this miraculous, kind of like petroleum is for us in the chemical industry, just this almost miraculous substance which has near infinite potential in it. That's what matter is. But then you're left to ask, well, what exactly is colonizing matter? Because that thing which is colonizing matter, and again, Peterson says this in that video, that thing which is colonizing matter is more real than the matter itself, which is exactly the point that that Brett Sockold, the author of this book, was making about the assumption of the word substance in the medieval period. Now, these words are living things, and how they live among us migrates, which in some ways makes all of our books less useful, because the words no longer mean to us what they meant to them. And, of course, Brett tracked a lot of that. But you simply, I remember listening to Daniel Dennett on an episode of Unbelievable and talking about basic reality. Daniel Dennett said, well, there's matter and there's information. And I thought, he just gave up the game. It just, once you sneak information in the sense that it is that which forms matter, you can no longer be a materialist. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Information is spirit, for sure. I've been rereading, I think I talked to you about this a long time ago, that great war book between C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield, which I think is a really fascinating book. I don't know if you ever got your hands on that, but it was such a difficult book. I thought that would be the easiest place to start, but it was actually the hardest because it gets very technical quickly. But now, having spent all this time with Barfield and Vervaeke and Peterson, it's a much different read at this point. And that was one of the fundamental contentions between Lewis and Barfield was what is the actual nature of truth itself. And Lewis, in his pre-Christian state, wanted to hold on to this idea of something static and eternal, not too unlike the materialist view of reality, that it is this kind of unchanging thing that never changes, and that you can from a scientific point of view learn things about it that are eternal laws of the universe that never change. And so, when you think about this monarchical vision you often talk about, it's not only the view from nowhere, it's a view from no time. It's outside of time and claims to have a sort of eternal perspectival view on the whole thing, which we can't even claim to know. I mean, the speed of light could be changing subtly. We wouldn't know. I mean, like we have ways of trying to track it, and there's even skepticism or controversy sometimes about these issues. I don't know if they're warranted or not, but we don't have the granularity to get into and see if even these underlying realities are changing. And Barfield had the idea that there was something about truth that was this ongoing revelation or unfolding of reality coming to know itself, which ultimately plays into perceptions of God as well. What is God? Is he this thing that's written into stone, and or is he in some sort of meaningful process tied up into the ongoing drama of reality that's unfolding? Is there I don't know. There's really interesting questions there to be asked in the terms of the two, and you can see that one of the things that the book makes a really eloquent argument for in the introduction is that even though at the time Barfield was actually the more well known of the two, he'd already published 2 books, and C.S. Lewis had basically failed with his first 2 attempts at poetry, and had already written a document where he was just like really sad about like even his attempts to want to be an author. He was like in kind of rationalizing away, like, oh, why do I even want to do this? But there was a real impact on C.S. Lewis that even though he always disagreed with these kind of core elements of he thought Barfield had gotten wrong, but you can see how they played their way out, especially in his fiction, in terms of the ways in which God uses the imagination and myth and things to communicate to the human psyche. So very, very interesting book.
I wonder if I could bring that back around to kind of holding on to that idea, but bringing it back around to the thing you said earlier, Michael, about, and Paul too, about lying and how lying makes one weak. And in the conversation that I had with Annette that got retweeted by Jordan Peterson, She is a student of Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah, and so they really look at the biblical Hebrew. And she was primarily talking about this biblical Hebrew word for pestilence, because she wanted to talk about the corona. But I think this is interesting on so many other levels, because this word is deber. So D, B, and R are the three consonants. But so in the way that the Jewish mystics look at it is that all the Hebrew words that have the same three consonants are somehow connected to each other. And so deber, davar, and dever all have the same three consonants. One is pestilence, one is speech, the same word where it says that God spoke the worlds into existence. And the other one is matter, thing or matter. So speech and matter are somehow lined up together. And heaven only knows how they're lined up together with pestilence, but let's just leave that for another time. But just this idea of speech and matter being lined up. And you talk about words getting colonized. Well, I think lying has been way simplified by us today, because we think of that just in terms of, you know, you say an untruth. But lying is really a much bigger word, because lying is not only the little white lies or black lies that you tell, but it's how you use your speech. So if you're animated by some ideology so that your speech is completely hollow of any personal authentic meaning, and it's just simply this ideology that you're spewing, then all of your speech is a lie and it's making you weak. If your speech is all crudity, you've left the guts out of whatever it is that you might have had to offer the world, because all people are hearing is the crudity. Or I remember when my daughter was like, here I am, like, when she was like 12, she's always saying like this, like that, like the Valley Girls. And I would try to correct her every single time. When you do that, you are weakening your vocabulary, your potential for actually communicating something more meaningful. And one of the points that Annette was making is that over time, our speech in the world has become more and more and more corrupted. And that this moment in time right now has opened a space for us to reflect on how we've been using our speech. And I thought that was a really interesting point, because how we use our speech is really whether it is truth or lie.
Well, this is, I had a conversation about the popularized, the pictures of the individuals in the Michigan House, State House, with their long guns. And
what?
well, that was their protest of the pandemic restrictions.
Oh, okay.
And, just over the last, few years, noticing how the charge of, the label of white supremacy began being placed on everything, on many, many things. And I remember back in the 80s when I was in my systematics class with Neil Plantinga, he made the point, he said, we should practice stewardship with words, because when we use them improperly, they weaken. And so back then, he says, if you call lots of people Nazis, what word do you have left for actual Nazis? In other words, and I was thinking about, let's say, I don't know who in particular was in the Michigan State House with their long guns, but knowing something, I lived in Michigan for a number of years. Timothy McVeigh was part of if you remember the McVeigh, Oklahoma City bombing, the Michigan militias got a lot of attention back then. One of the things that you learn very quickly as a pastor when you're engaging a broad variety of people, especially in areas of belief that can get fairly metaphysical fairly quickly, including racism sometimes. It's important to be accurate in terms of, for an individual, what their particular beef is. Is it specifically racism connected, let's say, to a story of bias or discrimination? Is it are there really complaining about some economic realities? Because in many cases, if you actually want to engage them and move them towards, let's say, a more productive, less destructive path, knowing exactly what you're talking about and what their grievance is vitally important. Because if you miss it by just this much, they'll look at you and say, you're not listening to me. I mean, this is valuable in a marital fight. This is valuable in a conflict at your work environment. Listening carefully to people and finding the words that really express exactly what's at issue is vital if you're really going to make progress, rather, in terms of turning people from a path of destruction. And economy and accuracy of language is really, in many cases, the best tool we have.
You bet. And if you hear somebody use a word and you think you understand what they mean, nowadays you had better clarify, because all words have been corrupted. I mean, it's very hard to have a conversation with anybody without running into newspeak and Orwellian rewriting of history and everything else. Which gets me back to what Michael was saying about C.S. Lewis and his relationship with Barfield. That when you read C.S. Lewis, there's such beautiful compression of language there. Each sentence you could open up a book out of each sentence. And that was one of the things Annette Poizner said about Jordan Peterson too, is that since he came on the scene, there's 19 Facebook groups, all of whom are spending days and days and days talking with each other about this sentence or that sentence and all of the ideas that spill out from that. And so language is very, very important, the way words are chosen. And she was really challenging all of us to be careful with our words, which I think is the same thing as Jordan Peterson saying, speak the truth. At least don't lie.
Well, and it's interesting too, right? Because one of the things that's come out of this Jordan Peterson phenomenon is all these conversations like the one we're having now. And I was reflecting a while back in terms of what was so impactful for me in terms of engaging with your work, Paul, and yours as well, Karen. And one of the things for me is just the ways in which you guys engage in conversations and just coming into awareness of the possibilities and the affordances you guys make in terms of your approach to the other individual and what you and the ways in which you both challenge the person you're with, but also have a lot of charity towards them and a lot of I don't know, just I would say it's sort of like a hope, but it's more of like just a belief in the best in that person and sort of calling them forth into being in the process of the conversation, just with how you engage with people. And so that for me, I think was I think I was attracted initially to all the propositional ideas, but seeing embodied forms of how to have a dialogue had much more deeper impacts, even in terms of my own ability to have a honest conversation with myself and how to be charitable and patient and listen to the other parts of myself. It's been useful to watch people have patient, charitable conversations with each other.
I will learn a lot from Paul on that score, certainly.
I hardly think so. And I, often I would hear people say things like this, and I thought, well, these things have been not always successfully, but these things have been practiced in the church for a very long time. because if there's something we work at in the church a lot, it's trying to speak productively with each other, because it's so darn hard. And people join churches and they're like, churches are full of hypocrites and conflicts. Yeah, they are. And that's exactly why we continue to meet and continue to, because it's not unlike if you want to go to the Olympics. It's going to be a lot of effort of doing things you don't want to do to be able to do things you do want to be able to do. It's, it's a Dallas Willardism. But that's what training versus trying, which of course John Ortberg picked up on. So no, it's, and so I've said this a number of times, even though I don't necessarily spend a lot of time on the Discord server. When I do, I often just try to step in quietly and scan through what they're talking about. That is, in many ways, if I can model and embody and leave behind people doing this, you can't ask for a lot more than that, really.
I love the comment threads on all your videos. Sometimes I won't even watch the video. I'll just get on if I don't have time to watch a video, I'll just get on the comment thread, and yeah, it's always an education. And I meet such interesting people on there. Yeah.
And that was total surprise to me, because I had expected, I'd read comment threads on Jordan, and part of its size of the channel too, obviously. But I was listening to one of Eric Weinstein's podcasts this morning, and Eric was talking about, basically drawing lines and banning people. And I'm not going to say that there is never a time for that. But again, part of what working, especially in a smallish local church as a pastor, you learn is that there aren't any unnecessary people in the church. The church needs every one of them, sometimes particularly the most difficult people, because they are playing a role in that church that is forcing the growth of others. Now they have to deal with this person and their difficulties. How many times can you listen to the same conversation? How much rude behavior can you tolerate without showing them the door? Can you, with that rude behavior, begin to gently move them to being able to have productive interchanges with others? It's all the work of the church.
I'm glad people did that work on me when I first started to go. I was confronted more than once, and often not in the kindest way.
That's the work of mothers too. That's mothers and fathers, but often mothers, molding those little children. So, and again, Jordan Peterson talked, socializing them. You've got to get that kid socialized by a certain date, because I'll tell you, and I deal with a lot of adults who the important stuff didn't happen before they're 6. So now they have to spend, 5 times more time and effort trying to learn it later in life, because they didn't get that blessing when they were small. That's so hard.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that, Jordan, how many of these conversations taking place now have some of his imprint in them. And I've thought often about like what sort of, it seems like one of the things he's done is he opened up this sort of space, and he didn't create the jargon that he uses. He's kind of assimilated from all these other places, but he did put all these things into a single arena and gave people some motivations to say, hey, there's a lot of gold here in all this old stuff. And one of the things I think, specifically in religious language, which is by definition is about the most important things. And I think conceptually in the modern frame, it was always looked at these kind of levels of abstraction up into the clouds that may or may not have any real reality to them. They may be complete fabrications of the human consciousness. And so we could dismiss with them entirely. He's done all this work to show actually they go all the way from the top of the hierarchy, but they go all the way down, way below it. And that they have these roots that go really deep. And they connect into all the, so you're a materialist, you're an evolutionist. Well, this stuff really goes down into here in deep ways. And it had this ability to kind of expand the definition of people who could suddenly be on the same page and have a conversation. They had the jargon, the language to do it. And suddenly they also had this impetus because he was saying like, okay, these ideas, they're not just philosophical ideas. They're not for the ivory tower types. These things have, inescapable consequences for every single human life. So it's eminently practical for you to have a conversation and think about these things.
It's interesting. I mean, again, people will look at Jordan's flaws, of which, of course, he has them. But what happened downstream of him there was not something to be missed. And that was one of my largest frustrations with many of my clergy colleagues. I would try and say, hey, look, pay attention to that thing over there. You've been longing for a change in your context in order to provide opportunity and new life, and something's happening over there. Go pay attention to that burning bush over there, because something is happening. I don't know what it is, but it's worth paying attention to. And the fact that here, I mean, he's been effectively out of action for 9 months now, and I would even argue that a lot of what he did in the 6 to 9 months prior to it wasn't his real contribution. I think, again, going back to even before C16, now going back to a lot of the videos that are there, much of that was, really the contribution that C16 kind of put him on the map. And of course, the Kathy Newman interview and the Sam Harris conversations, the biblical series. But, the stuff was there to be found, and it launched good fruit.
Yeah, he was at the confluence of so many things that he's so easily mischaracterized in so many different directions. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, specifically in his lecture series at the university, that he's at the top of his game, because he took all the work he put into maps of meaning, combined it with both his clinical practice, with some of the research activities he was doing with his graduate students, and he distilled it down into something that an undergraduate, somebody that knows nothing could, which is all of us, could sit there and listen and get real practical value from.
And I was really amazed when Karen, showed up on my radar screen, because when Karen first sent me emails, it's like, what is she talking about? She's an artist, and I'm really interested in his work on anomaly. And I thought, did he ever say anything about anomaly? But did she point out? Yeah, he was saying these things. And so many of us found vectors into it, but then so many people found, and this came through with my conversations with Ron Dart, what he noticed immediately was that now students are suddenly interested in many ways, reading better books. And that's, boy, if you're a teacher, that's what you're looking for. That's what you're longing for. So, Karen, how now you've been, when did you find Jordan? And now a couple years into it, what are you noticing?
Well, it was either just before or just after the C16 thing, but I didn't learn about the C16 thing until I had been watching his videos for at least a month or so. And then I stumbled onto that C16 video. I didn't learn about the controversy surrounding it, but I saw the video that he made where he was announcing that he was going to stand for truth. And then I heard about the controversy. And I thought, the consequences of this are going to be very interesting. And then right after that, there was the big battle that he had on the quad at some university where he got into, they call it the suspender incident. He was wearing the suspenders and having this big debate.
Yeah.
And what I started to notice, I was very interested in his teaching, but I started to notice that every single thing that looked like an attack that would take down a normal person, because almost everybody else at that point was caving whenever they got attacked on anything. He stood his ground and spoke truth, but he spoke it in a very logical, and you could even say kind way back then. I mean, he was sometimes very strong, but also, you know, reasonable. And every time that would happen, he would catapult a little further into the public eye, and it started to go like this. And I've walked with the Lord long enough that I know I can kind of see where spaces start to open up, because there is something about opening a space that God fills. But it looked to me like God was opening that space somehow. That probably sounds a little woo, but I just thought, how else could it be happening that this guy, who was a nobody from nowhere, basically, I mean, he was a college professor, but there are a dime a dozen.
Yeah. And
he had written a book, but it was published 20 years ago, you know, who cares? All of a sudden, he's getting more and more traction. So I started paying attention to that trajectory. And it just got more and more. Every single thing just gave him more visibility. So I thought, okay, one of the other things that I've learned as a believer is that there are people who get attacked all the time. They have something very important that we ought to be listening to. Not necessarily that we have to believe everything that they say, but there's something going on there. And so I started watching all of his videos, and then he came out with the biblical series, and that happened to coincide with the time that I had surgery. So I was laid up for 6 weeks. Gave me a perfect opportunity to watch the whole biblical series, catch up on all 45 hours of it. And that was kind of the beginning of a trajectory for me, because I found the ideas so compelling, partly because he was slotting into things that I had been learning over the past 30 years. I had the notes written in the margins of my Bible all the time. Every time that God taught me something that was a major trajectory change in my life, I'd slot it in my Bible, and he'd be talking along and he'd be saying, and this, and then I'm, whoa, that was 1989. I remember that. So I knew there was really something there, and that what he was saying somehow lined up with biblical truth. But I also saw the way that he was lining up physics and chemistry and biology and history. And in my own mind, I saw art just falling right in there. In fact, art seemed to be the connecting rod that went up through all the different levels of reality. And it started to put this picture in my mind that I wanted to capture. I want to write a book about it, but I'm just not disciplined enough to sit down and hammer those ideas out. So when you challenged me to start a channel, I thought I can explore physics and chemistry and history and theology and philosophy with people, and see where see if I'm correct in my assessment of how these things line up. And it's been a really interesting adventure, as I met fascinating people, and there's just way more to the world than what it seems. Let's just put it like that.
That is true. Well, I'm so glad you did start your channel. And I say this to many people because a number of people have started channels, and I say, don't worry about the subscriber numbers. And, I think Michael, your observation about, at certain point, Barfield was far more famous than Lewis. Of course, the reverse is true. We don't know. And the growth of my channel, I really can't. I mean, the timing was perfect, but I had no idea. I just did it, and it grew at certain size, and it's kind of stayed that size, and that's okay. And in many ways, I'm quite grateful it hasn't grown larger, because what I really want out of it is what we're doing now, and increased conversation partners. And so I always tell people, I encourage them to start something, and I say, do something that is its own reward, so that even if hardly anybody follows you, the thing in and of itself is productive for you. And so that will keep you doing it. And I learned that from blogging, because I blogged for years, and, not a lot of, very few people. Every now and then somebody might read something and send me something. But if you do it for your own reasons and it's worthwhile for you, you'll maintain it. And then you'll probably have a good shot at being productive. And of course, that has brought, all these crazy randos together, of which we are all we are all some of them in our own ways. Well, why I'm curious too, because what's been fun, and this is not unlike pastoring a small church. So you two found each other as good conversation partners, because you two have had multiple conversations on Karen's channel. I mean, how, tell me more about that.
Let me go first, because I think I started, when you first started doing your videos, Karen, I was, especially some of those early videos with Alex, where you guys would just go so deep in the weeds about some sort of, phenomena, like stochastic resonance or something like that. And I was just so overjoyed with the patience and space you guys both created for each other in those conversations to explore something. And what I found really interesting was, oftentimes I couldn't follow you from A to B to C to D, but you guys would always get to these like such amazing conclusions. And I from me watching it, I always had this very clear sense that, how is that possible? Because it's like, I don't see how these line up, but then I see that they're going to these great, interesting places. It just became really clear to me that God had to be in the conversation, kind of giving it these little nudges to get to the right place. And so I commented on some of Karen's early videos, and then we had some conversations. And then, as it turns out, she, the company I work for is actually headquartered like 15 minutes from where she lives. So I've been out that way a few times and gotten to meet her in person and go to her meetup. And yeah, it's been a really fascinating experience for me. And just watching her work has been really fruitful for me in all our conversations.
Well, I saw Michael's comments in the comment thread under my videos, and he always had such interesting things to say. So finally, I don't know, after a few weeks or months or something, I said, hey, do you want to come and talk to us? He was particularly interested in Alex. So I said, you want to come and have a conversation with me and Alex? And then I decided to just have a conversation with him. Well, Alex got really busy with something. I can't remember what. Alex has been really tied up with some family issue. And then over time, it's been really, it's been one of those things that's been interesting for me to watch, because Michael and I will have a conversation or two, and then something else gets on my radar. I get busy with something else. And after a while, Michael might come back and he'll say, oh, I've been thinking about this thing. Oh, wow, I've been thinking about that too. Let's talk. And then sometimes I'll contact him and I'll say, here's this thing I've been thinking about. I've been writing. What do you think? And he'll say, oh, let's talk. And so, it's been just great having someone to share ideas with, because I'm a fountain of ideas, but I'm not very good at remembering my ideas. I'll throw stuff out there, and then, 2 or 3 days later, somebody will say, well, what about this thing you were talking about? And I'm like, did I say that? I don't even remember. But Michael can kind of keep me on track, and having an ongoing conversation with him helps me kind of rein it in. So I like that.
Well, that's, I've got the same fountain issue. And that's, again, part of why I do the monologue videos I do, because I find that if I don't direct the flow someplace, it kind of splashes out and then sinks into the ground and disappears. So it's like, well, I'm going to direct the flow out here and we'll see if it does something. But I want to deconstruct.
I don't understand your process. I don't understand how you can get all that stuff done, because I can't even figure out how to make a decent thumbnail. And you produce these beautiful thumbnails. I mean, how are you doing that? And then how do you get all those slides put together where do you get the time for that stuff?
I'm very efficient at some things. And if if you would go back in my channel and look at sermons from 5 years ago, and you notice the slides look the same, it's like, I know how to do this. And then some people will come to me and they'll say, well, you could do it this way. And you could, yeah, I could, but you know how much time it would take for me to relearn that? Yeah. I got my little process here, and I do tinker with it. And I have been tinkering with it, but it's like, to stop and learn something totally new, maybe in retirement, but not now. So, because it's right, because for every monologue video I put out, there are probably 3 or 4 that just died on the vine, because I didn't have time I had the idea, I had the vision for the video. I might have even made a little PowerPoint or started a little PowerPoint, but I got distracted. I'm way too ADHD. So sometimes if I get an idea for a video, it'll be like, I can't listen to any other videos. I can't listen to any other audiobooks. I got to segregate myself until I can get the video out, and then I can pour more things in, because otherwise so if there's a pause in my channel, it's usually because 3 ideas got stuck together and I can't get any one of them out. And so then I produce nothing. So, but I want to deconstruct. I want to deconstruct a little bit of Christianese, because, God had to be in the conversation. Okay. Now,
Michael said that, not me.
I know Michael said that. But you had enough of your own Christianese down there too, Karen.
Oh yeah. I was, as soon as you said Christianese, I thought, walking with the Lord.
Yeah. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with Christianese, just like there's absolutely nothing wrong with any kind of language. It's just the words that we use. But I think it's helpful. So when we say, God had to be in the conversation, I mean, I understand. I mean, that's very much God number 2 talk. But I think part of this, and I think, Michael, you really you really led us on a good foot initially in terms of, so when we've got someone who's a little bit allergic to the woo out there, and they hear, God had to be in the conversation, and they get triggered, how could we translate that to something that someone who's at least at this point, 300 level in Jordan Petersonese, how could we translate that?
I mean, I think you could think of it as the kind of exercise we talked about at the beginning, in a phenomenological way of kind of that the 2 people involved in this conversation were in some sense personifying this spirit of truth that we were praying to at the beginning and asking to be a part of this conversation, that they're in some sense doing that. I mean, for me though, again, now that I'm on the other side of that line of skepticism, it's also very clear to me that I don't know that there's some fundamental component of consciousness itself that has to be in communication with this all the time, because I've talked about this with Karen over and over and over again, but to me, it's just miraculous that conversations like this can be productive at all. If you think about this sort, I mean, I think about it more from an information processing point of view, and the way in which, I have these ideas and they get distilled down into words, and these words have unique connotations for me and my personal experience. And then I'm not very articulate, so they get jumbled together in weird fashions. And I always listen back to things and it's not what I really meant to say. But somehow the other person kind of gets what I meant anyway. And there's just something that helps bridge that gap between the you and the I, that I think has to be what we would think of something as a larger consciousness that helps bridge this activity. Because it just, if you look at it at an information processing point of view, the errors coming down from just compressing all this data into something I can now put into words to give to you, and you have to now decompress that back out into something that makes sense to you. It's amazing that anything gets through that process at all, from my perspective. Maybe somebody else can show me the math why it's not that impressive, but I would be really shocked.
I would be really shocked too. And I thought, before we had this conversation, you guys had a conversation and you kind of pointed me to that. And I listened to that conversation, and you had I almost used that's one of the 3 videos that never got born. One of the, Michael, you just had a string in that video where you so much better, you laid out better what I was trying to say with, religion is the JPEG of meaning, that you take you take all this compression down, and the fact that we can, even with our lossy, JPEG is a lossy compression scheme, even with our lossy, enormously lossy tools that we are using to converse, the fact that, moving airways, and now moving airways into this microphone and, to the internet, Zoom and all this stuff, the fact that we are doing this at all, and doing this as well as we do it, and doing it as reliably as we do it, it's just, miraculous is not too big a word for the stuff we consider mundane and normal. And that's why, again, for me, when you get into, it's why face-to-face meetups are important. Real community like you find in a household or a church or an office or a friendship. The fact that we can do this at all, because if you've ever had, a conflict in a family or a marriage or an office or a friendship, you realize just how much stuff, 2 people's, and I think Peterson deals with this well, again, in Personality number 12 of 2017, just how much stuff is compressed into this. And we're actually managing it in a way that, if you've gotten at odds with a friend, and okay, so we're not going to avoid, we're going to meet and we're going to talk, and both people going into it are already really skeptical that the conversation itself will make it right. And we don't even know what making it right means, but we know it is right. And so, in that sense, God had to be in the conversation, now not reducing God into this, merely this thing within the system, as Brett Sockold and Bishop Barron. That's an excellent video he did on Cuomo's comment. But, when it works, God had to be in the conversation, because it's so enormous that the fact that anything worked at all is just miraculous.
Well, you know how in that video, Jordan Peterson is talking about how the past and the present get compressed together, because maybe the last 50 arguments that you've had are all compressed into this argument that you're having right now. And, you have to go back and untangle all of that in order to be able to untangle where you're at. So the past and present are compressed into the moment, but the future is all folded up inside the present and then unfolds. Okay? So take that idea and put it together with something else he said, where when you're having a conversation with someone, you need to enter it with the idea that they have something that you need to know. They have something you need to learn. And I've been trying to practice that. I think I did it better in the first dozen videos than I do it now, because sometimes I get a little, I don't know, flippant about things, or sometimes I'm not well prepared when I go into the video, or sometimes I over prepare. If I over prepare, then I have all my ideas I have to get out there, you know. But in the beginning, I was really exploring, and I had this idea, these people I'm talking to, they have something I really need to understand. So when they would say something, my whole point was to try to explore, what is it that they're saying, and what is it saying to me, and where does it fit in this space in between us? And so I was very conscious of the fact that it's them and me and this space that's in between. And there's something, I think that's a critical part of the structure of the universe, these two binaries with the space in between. And that seems to be at every level of reality in almost everything. And Michael and I have had a number of conversations about this, just trying to figure out what that thing is. But it's that space between that. And I'm just going to throw this out here, because this was one thing I wanted to say today, and I don't know how much time we have left, so it kind of fits in here. With the whole Corona thing, I think what a lot of people are looking at it with all the problems involved in who to be angry with and who to blame and all of that. And that's all very interesting conversation, and I'm sure a lot of people are enjoying having that conversation, but I don't want to talk about those things. But to me, what I'm seeing is that there is a space here where I can look and see, where are the places that I can have gratitude for whatever I see that God might be doing in this moment. Where is God in this moment? Let's not argue about who caused this or, you know, any of that, but just in this moment, there is this space, and this space is covering the whole globe. And in that space, something is happening at the individual level, the family level, the community level, the state level, the national level, the international level. There's all kinds of things happening in that space, many of which we can approach with gratitude. And to me, that's the same picture as the picture of this conversation, that leaves a space to see, what can I learn in this moment?
So unpack a little bit more when you say, where is God in this moment? Unpack that.
You need me to unpack it from the Jordan Peterson standpoint?
Well, unpack it any way you want to. I mean, because you mean something by that. And now,
because I'm conscious of I'm like you, very ADHD. Every time I have a thought, it's got strings going out in 48 directions. One of those strings is, I can hear this person over here saying, well, are you saying that God is the one who caused this pandemic because he wants to teach us something, or he wants to punish us? No, that's not what I'm saying. Okay. I think what I'm saying is that my experience in life has been that when I am in the crucible of some sort of suffering, if I approach it from the standpoint of shaking my fist at whatever caused this thing, I don't get anywhere. If I approach it from the standpoint of, why me? Why poor little me? Why did this happen to me? I don't get anywhere. If I approach it from the standpoint of, okay, I'm here. Maybe I can't be thankful for this thing that has happened to me, but I can be thankful for what might come out of it. And that's a very hard place to get to, because you have to have had a number of experiences in the past where you can see the past from the future. And so maybe you're blessed with the opportunity to go through minor sufferings and come out the other side having learned something, and then you can look back and say, oh yeah, in the valley I learned something. Not everybody gets that privilege. Sometimes you go through the big hole first. But on the other side, there is something that has been gained. And this is Jordan Peterson's thing about anomaly, right? That the anomaly is the stumbling stone. It's the thing you trip over. It's the thing that appears out of nowhere that creates all kinds of problems for you. It's the falling into chaos. That's the anomaly. So, but there are treasures when you fall into the darkness. And so the journey is to go voluntarily into the chaos and find where the treasures are. Well, the whole world is in chaos right now. And if we believe what Jordan Peterson tells us, there are treasures in the darkness. And so I'm just looking around and I am seeing a whole pile of treasures all the way from the international down to the individual level. And I think that would be a great conversation to be had worldwide if we could get a movement going of let's go treasure hunting, because whoever caused this thing, when we come out the other side, if we come out with treasures in hand, we can revivify the old structure and have something new.
It's really good. Thank you.
You forced me into it.
It was really good. It was worth it. It was well worth it. I really like what you laid out there. So true. So good. And you know, it was just now that, because you talked about the anomaly, and I was trying to think at the beginning of, because I've always been an auditory learner, and I learn more from listening than I do from reading often. Reading is different. I mean, reading is, you can kind of go back and reread, and you know, it's a little bit more monarchical reading than listening. Auditory is diachronastic, but the you know, the conversation, the beginning of the conversation with Roger Scruton at Cambridge, when Peterson leads off that conversation talking about, you know, God is the transcendent. They weren't using the word God, they're using the transcendent.
Mm-hmm.
You discover the transcendent when you, it didn't say make a mistake, but it's similar to that. It's the anomaly. And it happens when you have a partner with whom you must contend. And so to go back to Jacob is fleeing Laban. Now Jacob's been a fleer. He fled Esau into the arms of Laban, where he got not one wife but two, plus 2 handmaidens and 12 sons and many daughters and herds. Now he's fleeing Laban and learning that Esau is coming with 400 men. And so the consummate schemer, first sends the herds and then the concubines and sons he cares least about, and then the wife he cares most about, and then what's at the top of his hierarchy is little old him at the back of the line. And that's where God meets him after, you know, and of course the conversation having started, you know, obviously started long before Jacob was born, and the wrestling in the womb and the naming, but then the conversation in terms of Jacob's consciousness starts at Bethel, and God, you know, showing him the stairway where angels are going up and down and saying, Jacob, I'm going to bless you. And Jacob saying, I'll tell you what, if you do. And it's like, you know, he can't even trust a gift. That's how bad he is. And so then God has him between Laban and Esau, and God's like, I have you exactly where I want you. Let's contend now. And that's Israel. That's us. So no, beautifully said, Karen. Thank you.
But the interesting thing about that story is that Jacob ended up in that spot by his own devices.
Yes.
And I think to a large extent, as a world, we have ended up in this spot by our own devices. Nothing we can pin on God. And
Oh,
yet,
yeah.
and yet he is merciful and gracious and will give us gifts if we will turn to him and ask what they are with open hands, humility, and gratitude, as Jordan Peterson would say.
Yeah. I don't know, Michael, you have anything you want to throw in here?
Well, I did want to get your idea on one thing that I've noticed is another side effect of this Jordan Peterson phenomenon is that it seems to have also brought this expansion in the definition of what we think of as Christian. And he's kind of, you have this kind of all these different voices that are somehow clamoring, like that were possibly lost before, like the Eastern Orthodox, and even people that would even be considered heretical, like people that have different alternate views of the Trinity and things like that, that are suddenly arising into or suddenly having a voice. And I'm curious if you have had any reflection on like what's going on there and why. I don't know what is there some sort of expansion of Christian orthodoxy that's in the works right now, or what's going on with all that?
Now I'm on the spot. That's good. I think, one of the observations I made reading Alistair McGrath's book, when you're about to get into hot water, you might as well share it with, a better known name. Alistair McGrath's book on heresy. And Sam says it's not in the book, but, I'm reading it into the book. Well, maybe so. If you look at the patristic period, orthodoxy and heresy.
Well, there's a Christianese word. You better explain to your listeners what the patristic period was.
If you look at the first 500 years of
that out.
Fair enough. If you look at the first 500 years of church history, when all of these formulations of things like Trinity got started, and I found it very interesting from Brett. I don't know why doesn't Amazon, they should give me a cut here. Freddie should, I got some Pepsi here. Where's Freddie's endorsement? But the fact that discussion about what was happening in the Eucharist was simply not talked about for the first 1,000 years of church history. It's like,
now, the Eucharist is when you have the bread and the wine during the church service, right?
Yes.
No, I didn't know what that word Eucharist
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were teasing me about my Christianese. Yes, the Lord's Supper.
No. I mean, I know what the Eucharist is now, but I think it's only been I've been a Christian for 40 years, and it's only been in the last 5 or 10 years that I probably ever heard that word bandied around.
Yeah.
It's not a word that shows up in a lot of churches. You don't say,
it was a word Protestants didn't use.
Yeah,
on purpose.
We're going to have the bread and the wine.
Yeah.
What does Eucharist actually mean?
It's which means it's the good, the Greek prefix, and charis is grace. It's good grace.
It's a good grace.
It's the grace given by Christ to us, right there. And Protestants wouldn't use the word because it sounded papish or Romanish. And one of the blessings of the culture war is that to a certain degree, at least in the United States, Roman Catholics and Protestants have stopped fighting the way they did even 40, 50 years ago. I mean, that's a huge change in the church in North America that we pay too little attention to. So, where was I going with this? What was I talking about?
Heresy.
Heresy. Yeah, heresy. The church doesn't find orthodoxy without heresy. And they sort of, because, and the church usually finds heresy because there's a missiological challenge that needs to be addressed. And so someone comes up with a bad idea. And the others listening say, well, I'm not so sure about that idea. And so then they start having a discussion and they start having a fight. And they don't always fight productively, but in the process, things start coming out of it that the church begins to realize fairly early on that if you get this, something like the formulation of the Trinity wrong, that other things sort of slide off in a bad direction. So that's the whole idea behind orthodoxy and dogma. So, and a lot of, you know.
So can I just clarify here? Is that the
Yes.
picture then of two competing narratives actually bringing out the best in each so that it's moving up into a third thing, and then that thing ends up getting competed against by something else and pushing? So it's an upward trajectory. Okay.
To let in Hegel, but probably, yeah. And that's it.
But I think there must be some, I think there's some needle to be threaded there where it's not exactly Hegel.
Yes.
But I don't know enough about Hegel to thread that needle, but I think that what you're talking about is the good fight. Okay.
Well, it's you know, it's not unlike, again, Peterson's first biblical series, arguably his best. You know, he had all these pent up ideas. It's like, whoosh, out they come. But first you act it out. And so you get to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus is resurrected from the dead, and you've got 500 people there. And I love the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospels are so honest. And they worshiped him, but some doubted. And it's like, you know, wait a minute, this is a group of Jews. Now, Samuel quick to say, well, worship there literally means they bowed down before him. And, you know, you would bow down before certain people. But I think we all know you don't bow down before your rabbi, not in this way. And so something's going on with Jesus. And very early on, you get things like the Christ song in the book of Philippians. And, you know, part of what makes the Apostle Paul's writing so interesting is that they're so early. And so right away, there's this, they're talking about Jesus. First, they're acting towards Jesus. Then they're talking about Jesus with these terms that are very, that rightly make the Judaizers very uncomfortable, because we Jews don't talk about human beings like this. And you get the inkling of it, let's say, in the stilling of the storm scene, where, you know, they're almost I mean, Jesus stands up and stills the storm. Again, I mean, think about what that would be like in that moment. I mean, something has just happened that is so deeply disturbing that suddenly all of this history that is just rock solid in you begins to shake. And the disciples are, the words of the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are basically, you know, scared to death of him, because, you know, what just happened? And so that is what happens around Jesus. And so then suddenly, upon further reflection, with all of the tools lying around of people's worldviews within their cultures, you have to start answering this question. Well, what is Jesus? Is he, well, he's a man, but, and then, you know, what on earth do we mean by this word God? And I think, again, Peterson says it well in that when we use this word, it's so lossy in terms of the resolution of this word for us. And it's so fudgy. People are throwing all kinds of other things into the word that, what do we mean by it? And so so people start offering options, and other people listen to it and think, and they're reading like the Hebrew scriptures and then the letters of Paul, and they're saying, well, that can't quite be right. And then how about this? And so there's this massive community conversation going on over hundreds of years. And another video that I want to do is looking at Vervaeke's talking about problem solving, because okay, we need heuristics, but our heuristics are communal. So these communities begin to form and around certain ideas, and they start battling each other. And that, of course, all of that drama, I mean, that's why, all this political tension we have, if it can be productive, it can be good. All this drama brings the best thinkers and the best ideas and geniuses like Athanasius and Origen and, all of these people out of the woodwork, and they're working on this stuff. And over time, we actually begin to learn something. And that wouldn't happen without the heresy. And so now, because I remember, I mean, I can talk to Vervaeke, and I can talk to Peterson, and I can talk to, Joey. I can talk to all these atheists. We're all, as Christians, I get a pass talking to atheists because, well, that's evangelism. But then Sam comes on the channel and starts telling me his story. I'm like, oh, crap. Getting squirrely on the Trinity, that's legitimately something I can lose my job and my livelihood and my reputation over. So it's easier to not talk to Sam. But now the local pastors who suddenly get, Sam comes up one day and, oh, good, we got a musician coming into the church. And isn't this great? And then, oh, by the way, that Trinity thing, I'm not down on it. And then the pastor thinks, well, I'll just give him the few lines I learned in seminary about the Trinity. And he'll say, oh, now I understand it, and go away like a happy little sheep. And then they begin to learn that Sam's done way more reading about the Trinity than they ever did. And now suddenly that pastor realizes, oh, crap, I'm in real trouble now. What am I going to do? And so the easiest thing to do is to say, Sam, go away. Go away, Sam. But you're a pastor, and you shouldn't tell Sam to go away. So what does that mean? That means you have to contend with Sam. And you have to contend with Sam's ideas. And, as I was so happy for the conversation between Brett and Sam, because, me talking to Sam about church fathers and Trinity stuff, I mean, the opposition groups get schooled in their particularities about things. Just like as a young Calvinist, I was schooled in all the particularities against, the people close to us that we push against. So, okay, talk to a real scholar, Sam, and see where that goes. And, you talk to someone like Brett, and he says, well, when Aquinas was talking about transubstantiation, when Luther heard substance, Luther heard a different thing from Thomas Aquinas 400 years later. But those 400 years sound a lot less than the 400 years between us and, the 17th century, but they weren't. So, there's just, and so what is happening now? Well, I think the great unnerving walking away from the church that we see happening now, that many Christians are seeing in their children, in their grandchildren, in their friends, in their pastors, in their leaders, is forcing Christians away from their complacent decadence and smugness to say, what do you really believe? And it's not unlike what, I love the story of Eric Liddell. Tim Keller would talk about him quite a bit. Eric Liddell, who, of course, they made the movie Chariots of Fire about. This world-class sprinter who was also a world-class Christian goes, just pay attention sometime how many children of Chinese missionaries made amazing contributions in American cultural history, or even how many children of pastors. But he winds up being interned in a Japanese internment camp in China, because, of course, Americans don't recognize it, but the main battle for the Chinese was a war that they started in the early 30s in China. That was the big Japanese army campaign, was trying to swallow China, which was too big, they couldn't swallow it. But so they take all the expats and they put them in a little camp, and there's Eric Liddell. And it's all full of other missionaries and expats and business people and all that. And so they're watching all the missionaries, and they're noticing that most of the missionaries are just as much jerks as everybody else, that somehow the Christian formation didn't turn them into gold. But there's this Eric Liddell guy, and everybody in the camp just knows that there's something different about him, that there's a saint in their midst, and, well, the saint dies. Now, what is that? What does that do for all of our facile assumptions about God and church and institutions and the hard lines we draw? So I think we have, what will come of it, I don't know, but I think we have an interesting opportunity, even in our own little corner of the internet, to see a work of God that will, whether large or small, bring a degree of revival to God's church and God's kingdom. And that's what, so when I go to the Discord server and I talk to the people leading the Discord server, and they say, we have a problem. It's all of the chatter on our server, it's all Christian stuff. And I say, you know what, that is a problem. It's a problem I'm happy to have, but it is a problem because, just, you're right, Karen, I like how you talked about making space. We need to make space, and we need to have a channel where, if in our midst there are no more atheists, then we have a problem. That there are no more atheists who can speak honestly and tell us we're full of crap and they don't believe a word we say, but they still want to talk to us. That's exactly where I want to be. So that's what I think's happening. And so I welcome Sam, and I welcome Carl, and I welcome Joey, and I welcome, Carlos, the Filipino with his, I forget his quorum. Is it quorum? The Catholics have the Catholics do Protestant things all within their whole Catholic church. They just run their organization different, but all this amazing, and then, Shelley from the mission in Africa, and, all these people sneaking into Orthodox churches. It's crazy chaotic, but I think it's beautiful, beautifully fertile and terribly messy. And I think God is all over it.
Do you think go ahead.
You go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think there's in terms of some of these voices coming into the fore now, like it's perhaps a recognition of maybe that these Orthodox formulations need an updating, and that there could be maybe even updating such that we could have a more unified view of what the body of Christ is?
I think absolutely. I think, just like, the Reformation tried to update, it was clear from Brett's work that the Reformation needed to try to update what was being understood by Aquinas. Well, so much has happened in the last 500 years. Secularity. I mean, when Tom Holland came along and I saw secularity in an entirely new light, I saw, yeah, there is, God is at work all over the place, and God has been moving through the parts of the world that have been completely resistant to his church through secularity. It's crazy, but it's true. And God is just so sneaky to get under the radar. And so often I talk to skeptics and atheists, and I feel bad for them but happy, because it's like, you have no idea how much danger you're in if you want to stick with your worldview, because it's C.S. Lewis's line, an atheist had better be awfully circumspect about the books they read, because it's just never a fair fight between you and God. It's never a fair fight. And that sounds wooey, and you're allergic to woo, beware your allergies.
I was going to throw in one more thing that, for me, that Jordan Peterson has really changed for me. And that is, when I read the word now, it opens up to me in a different way. I see things I never would have noticed before. In reference to when you were talking about Sam and Trinitarianism and everything, I have the absolute blessing of having grown up in a family where there was no religious instruction whatsoever. I had no preconceptions about anything. I didn't become a Christian until I was 30 years old. And even then, it was in a very small little country church where they didn't teach any theology, any of that, right? So I was kind of a blank slate for many, many, many years, and only learned through reading the Word, learning what I learned, and
The
through
meaning of the Bible.
reading the Bible, yes, and through living life and having experiences and having to figure out how to do life using this heuristic, could I call it heuristic? But so the other day I was reading John 17, and which is Jesus's prayer when at the Last Supper, his prayer in the upper room. And Jesus is talking to his Father. And there's a couple of verses in there I had just kind of blown over for years and years and years, never noticed. And he says, I thank you, Father, for the glory that I had when I was with you before the worlds began. Now, I mean, I always noticed that he was with God before the worlds began. I always noticed that. But the glory
Is with the Father.
With the Father, yes. I had never noticed that whole thing about the glory thing. So that's a really radical statement. And I'm sure that there were a lot of people long before Paul came along and started making his arguments. I'm sure there were a lot of people who said, what was this guy saying about himself? I mean, there's other places he says radical things about himself, but that one to me was like, that's the height of radical. Then the other thing is when I'm reading along and it says that he is the keystone or the capstone. Okay, then I remembered a book that I read years ago that was a history of how arches were invented and built. And the history was told in order to lay the groundwork for a story about this very humble builder who built one of the, I think, monasteries or something in the 1300s. And the work that it took, you know, how many years it took to build this stone thing and what it took to put an archway together and everything. So I thought, I'm just going to get on Wikipedia and find out what it says about the history of keystones and arches. Oh, wow. Just opens your mind up, because all the stones that are in the arch, there's no stability at all in this thing until the keystone is put in. So that's the important stone, that one up at the top. But even after the keystone is in, it's not the keystone that takes all the stress. There's a lot of stress that's happening in that whole archway. And the stress loads are different for each stone. And I mean, that's the body of Christ, you know, and the stress load changes all the time, depending on the other forces that are acting upon this archway and the way the rest of the building is put together. You know, I mean, there's all these pictures in there. So when I read the Bible now, all this riches just unfolds to me, and it's a great adventure.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the last video I made last monologue I had about, little pastoral wish list for Jordan. It was Jordan Peterson that sparked this for how many thousands of people?
I'd say millions, maybe billions.
Yeah. We don't know. We don't, just like in my Sunday sermon, I read a little bit from The Great Divorce where Lewis says, you don't know it's like when you throw a pebble in the pond and those ripples go out. You don't know where those ripples will go. And I just think, what a cool thing. And I'm so deeply, every time, I've only shaken Jordan's hand 2-3 times maybe at these little, VIP thing after, because if I pay the extra bucks or something, or someone gets me in, I would just want to say thank you. Whatever you hear from me, I got all kinds of critiques and ideas about what you're doing, but there's one word I want to tell you. It's thank you. Thank you for, doing what you did, and it came at a great cost to him. But thank you. You've blessed me, and I think you've blessed the world. So thank you. That's how I feel.
Thank you, Jordan Peterson.
Thank you, Jordan Peterson.
Yep.
If I could put in one quick plug before we finish here, since we already dipped a toe into the waters of heresy. I've spent a lot of time with David Bentley Hart's most recent book, That All Shall Be Saved. Have you
I haven't read it.
looked at it all?
Nope.
I would love it if you at some point found it's a rather short book. I've actually read it 3 or 4 times already. And I read it specifically wanting to upend and overthrow some of the arguments in the book. I kind of had my own point of view, largely influenced by C.S. Lewis going into it. And I found the book really compelling. And I've been in a process of wrestling with that over the last weeks and months. And I've actually been looking over the internet, just trying to find anybody I can find that has intelligent critiques of, hey, here's why this seems so compelling, but here's what he's missing. I can't find a single engagement with a book that, from my perspective, even attempted to engage the arguments of the book or even understand them. And so I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on it. And one of the misconceptions that I keep running into is people think that the book is an argument against the existence of hell, which it most certainly isn't, or judgment. It's very biblical in terms of, some of the arguments are very biblical in their nature of what that hell and judgment might look like. So it's not against that, but it is an idea of that all these things are with a view of eventual reconciliation of all things. And he makes some compelling arguments. So I'd be interested to hear you use all your intellectual abilities and the wide reading you've done to come back with another point of view on it at some point in time, if you have the energy.
Well, usually it all depends on, to sound terribly Greek, where the muse leads me, because I'm just darting all over the place, and I'm always reading far too many books at once than is probably fair to any book. There was a Christian foreign minister named Neil Punt who was, for a while, when retirement is like the safe haven for pastors when they can do their heretical work. So in his retirement, he wrote a couple little books on what he called biblical universalism. And he was playing with some Calvinism and saying, what if these things are this other way? And I thought he made a lot of interesting and good points. But one of the things that comes through quite clear is that there are in the New Testament these universalist passages, and they've been there as long as the New Testament has been there, and theologians have been wondering about them for a very long time. And it always, what always gives me, well, I don't know. You're right in that I don't think we can exclude judgment. Jesus speaks about judgment more clearly than anyone else in the New Testament, and more repeatedly and more forcefully. That ought to get our attention. Eventual reconciliation, I think most Christians will say, I hope so. But can I know so? And how does that change? Will that then obscure Jesus' warnings of judgment? So it's hard stuff, but David Bentley Hart is such an interesting guy. He writes so well that you can just kind of get lost in the beauty of his language. Sure. So I'm sure I'll get to it at one of these points.
Well, it's surprising. Some of the heavy hitters of, the early patristic, like Greg Gibbs of the Nicene Creed, they had very, it seems like from their writings that that's what they believed. And so I mean, I don't know, like I'm it's not something I would ever like feel strongly enough to instruct somebody in, but it's I don't know, there's something there that I don't know, it feels very timely for what we're going through now. And I don't think, for at least for me, in terms of the moments where I feel engaged with, where like I feel like it might be true, it doesn't for me anyway undermine the reality of that judgment, because I think one of the things that Jesus seems to highlight most clearly is both this idea of a reward and this idea of severe loss and regret.
Yeah.
And I do think it makes me think more deeply even about that. Like, it makes me think about what is the age to come? What is to have more of this spiritual, this soul thing that I am composed of, and what is it to have less of? And that's a really deep question that I don't see anybody when they talk about heaven or hell or talking about those things, but it's interesting to be confronted with.
Are we done?
I think so.
Oh, this was great fun.
2 hours.
Oh yeah. This was great fun. So I really appreciate both of you giving your time, and I appreciate both of you, just keep doing what you're doing, and, don't worry about how many people watch the conversation. One of the things that I've learned actually is that it's not necessarily the most important thing is not necessarily how many people have clicked, the little triangle to start the video. It's how the conversation has impacted someone. And Google Analytics don't tell you that. What tells you that is, and also the crazy thing is that this stuff stays on your channel. And I regularly watch videos that have been out there for years. And now, having put plenty of videos out on YouTube, I know that, generally speaking, normally most of your views start right away, and then they kind of, trail off. And then your video kind of goes out there into obscurity. And then at some point, who knows what will happen to that video, and who knows what will happen to which video. And so I think we keep throwing pebbles into the pond, and we let God do what he wills.
You also said something earlier about this, how many new things we can put a number on nowadays. And that does give us this sort of illusion that we know what's going on with so many of these things that, as you just pretty eloquently laid out, we really have no idea what actual interaction and effect and impact on the human lives that C.S. Lewis says is the only eternal thing we get to interact with.
Yeah.
Is what effect it has on those.
Yeah. And Lewis, I like to remind people that by the end of World War II, everyone imagined Lewis's career was about over. Yeah, he had some academic stuff he was going to do, but those radio shows, and that was kind of the peak of it. And after that, no one was going to pay attention to Lewis. Well, look at Augustine. Augustine just seems to keep coming back. We have no idea, and then all of our metrics are within this age, not even the age to come. And we have no idea how what we do in this age impacts the age to come. We have no idea, but the New Testament seems to suggest many times that, no, we're seeding, and then Jesus says, well, basically spread good seed. So we don't know. We know so little. So anyway.
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Well, thank you both. This was a wonderful way to spend a couple of hours, and I don't know when I'll post this. It might be tomorrow. It might be next week. I got some other things in the works. So if it doesn't show up tomorrow, don't panic. All right.
All right.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks, Paul.
And we'll see how large Karen's channel grows.